Hello classy people, this is Josh the Top Hat Gamer, and this week I'm reviewing Homefront: The Revolution. 5 years ago I was subjected to the torture that was Homefront, a messy, paint-by-numbers shooter that squandered its interesting premise with frustrating characters and unpolished gameplay, among other things. I never thought anyone would bring this property back from the dead, yet here we are. So does Homefront: The Revolution have what it takes to rise above the unfortunate shadow cast by its predecessor? I certainly hope so. Homefront: The Revolution isn't a direct sequel to Homefront, but is instead a reimagining of its premise. In this alternate history, North Korea's substantial technological developments in the 70s caused them to become one of the world's most influential and powerful nations, while the US experiences an economic collapse due to continuous war efforts in the Middle East, and massive debt incurred from the purchase of North Korean weapons technology. When the United States are unable to repay the debt, North Korean officials use a backdoor into their weapons tech to shut down the US military and invade the country. Now the actual game takes place 4 years after these events, as a small resistance movement attempts to take back North Korean-occupied Philadelphia. The reworked premise is a bit more fleshed out than the original Homefront, giving us an entire alternate history to justify how the world has turned out, which I can appreciate. Despite the developers' best efforts, however, Homefront: The Revolution just doesn't deliver an enjoyable narrative. Your avatar is a member of the Revolution, but aside from the generic white dude name, he's completely devoid of any kind of character. I wish every other Resistance member you come into contact with could be so lucky, but as it stands, every single character you interact with is incredibly unlikable, and a bunch of them is borderline psychotic. At every turn I was hoping that the Revolution would fail, just to end the time I would have to spend working for these thugs. Most of my disdain for the cast of characters is due to their poorly written dialogue, but it doesn't help that their voice work is bland and often mixed so poorly that I couldn't figure out what anyone was saying without turning on the subtitles. Sound effects like gunfire and explosions sound fine, but the game's music is largely forgettable. The game's visuals would also be pretty forgettable if it weren't for the poor textures and character models making Homefront: The Revolution look like an early Xbox 360 game. Even with its depressingly low-quality visuals, Homefront: The Revolution runs worse than any other game I've played on a current-gen system. Load times are exceedingly long, character models consistently disappear or glitch out, and there's a massive stalling on almost every single autosave, sometimes freezing the game for upwards of 10 whole seconds at a time. When not being plagued by genuinely worrying autosave stalls, Homefront: The Revolution is a fairly generic shooter with a neat mechanic and an unnecessary open world. At this stage, I'm looking to say anything nice about the game, because otherwise I feel like I'm being unfair, so here goes. Homefront: The Revolution has a really cool modification system that allows you to change your weapon types on the fly, while adding and removing accessories at the same time. For instance, you can change your battle rifle to a marksman rifle or a so-called freedom launcher, which is really cool, and allows for a good deal of variety within each weapon. While I'm awarding the game some small victories, Homefront: The Revolution does feature a somewhat competent hacking minigame, and using vehicles feels far better than you might expect, though that may not be saying much when the base mechanics feel so terrible. The core gameplay just doesn't feel very good. Running and gunning isn't really an option, as you'll almost certainly be outnumbered by North Korean forces, and shooting from cover just feels clunky, whether you blind fire or pop out from cover and aim down sights. It doesn't help that every single weapon feels woefully inaccurate. I wasn't even halfway through the single player before the advent of future combat situations filled me with dread and made me just run through any conflict that wasn't mandatory. Speaking of mandatory gameplay aspects that filled me with dread, many of Homefront: The Revolution's story missions are locked off until you get each area's approval rating to 100%. You accomplish this by completing side activities in each area, such as saving prisoners or sabotaging equipment, but it feels like unnecessary padding. I feel like I spent more time filling these arbitrary meters than shooting, which is kind of weird for a first-person shooter. I think what I like the least about these sections is that you're constantly being recognized by enemy guards and drones, forcing you to take an even longer time to do simple tasks than it would if just walking to an objective was possible without inciting a gunfight. The stealth mechanics are functional, but it's easier and faster to just not bother and sprint to every objective. Even with these poor attempts to pad Homefront: The Revolution out, the game is still fairly short, clocking in at about 8 hours or so. If you're genuinely looking for more to do, and I don't know why you would, there's optional strike points to be found in the open world, as well as a co-op multiplayer mode called Resistance Mode. I would honestly recommend not checking out either. Was it wrong for me to think that Homefront: The Revolution might have succeeded where the original game failed? I'll be honest, I didn't go in expecting anything revolutionary, if you'll pardon the pun, but I thought it could be at least decent. Once again, The premise is just about the only thing worth noting here, and it's certainly not worth buying the game for. Homefront: The Revolution gets the Top Hat Gamer rating of awful. Inaccurate, clunky gunplay, incredibly underwhelming visuals and performance, unlikable characters and boring plot. These are the things that make Homefront: The Revolution just about one of the worst games I've played in a long time. There are one or two positives to take away from all this, but they're dwarfed by the game's sheer failure to deliver anything resembling an enjoyable experience. Do not buy this game. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the review informative. If you missed my last review on Doom, click the annotation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to throw this game in the trash.